In 1784, frontier surveyor John Sevier climbed into the Appalachian ridges and met a community that instantly stopped him in his tracks. Families with copper-toned skin, straight black hair, and European features. English spoken with an accent he couldn't place. Old words no dictionary recognized. A people who called themselves Portuguese, yet looked nothing like the Portuguese sailors Sevier had met. To early America, built on rigid categories of white, black, and Indian, these families were an impossibility, a living contradiction, a community that didn't fit the racial lines forming around them. Locals gave them a name that would follow them for centuries: Melungeons. No one knew where they came from. No one understood their origins. And within decades, the government would classify them as non-white, strip away their rights, and push them deep into the mountains, where isolation preserved something remarkable. One of the most unexpectedly diverse genetic signatures in North America. Centuries later, DNA testing would finally reveal the truth that history tried to bury. Their ancestors came from Europe, Africa, Native America, and the Mediterranean, blended in ways early Americans refused to acknowledge. The Melungeon mystery isn't just a footnote. It's a forgotten chapter of American ancestry that challenges everything we think we know about identity, race, and where our stories truly begin. This is the story of a people pushed into the shadows, mislabeled by neighbors and misclassified by the law, yet quietly carrying a genetic map of early America's most complex human mixture. We'll explore how these families were caught between racial worlds, how persecution forced them into mountain isolation, and how that same isolation preserved lineages that modern DNA testing is only now uncovering. We'll examine myths of Portuguese shipwrecks, Turkish captives, and the lost colony, trace documented colonial families who blended long before racial laws hardened, and reveal how autosomal DNA, not just haplogroups, finally exposes their real origins. If you love uncovering the hidden truths written into our DNA, subscribe. Here, we dig past the myths to restore the histories that were erased, forgotten, or never told at all. Now, let's return to the ridges where this story began, and follow the path that led to one of America's deepest ancestral mysteries.
They'd been here for generations, yet no one knew what they were.
When Sevier met the Ridge families in 1784, he wasn't just documenting a strange community. He was witnessing something early Americans had no category for. In a society dividing itself into three rigid groups, white, black, and Indian, these mountain families stood completely outside the system. They spoke English, but their rhythm was different. Stories passed through oral tradition carried unusual words, some echoing Elizabethan English, others sounding closer to Iberian or native phrasing. Their physical features didn't resolve into one ancestry either. Some looked Mediterranean, some indigenous, some African, and some European. To the families themselves, the explanation was simple. We are Portuguese. Not because they truly knew their origins, but because claiming a European identity was often the safest option in a world where ancestry determined legal survival. But to outsiders, this answer created even more suspicion. So local communities coined a label, Melungeons, a word with debated origins, possibly French, mélange, mixed, possibly Arabic, melun, cursed, possibly a frontier distortion. Whatever its root, it became a name used to mark them as different. What Sevier couldn't have known was this: these families were not newcomers. They were the descendants of an older, hidden chapter of colonial America, one erased as racial boundaries hardened, but still alive on those ridges. And soon, the country around them would become far more dangerous. For decades, Melungeon families lived like other Appalachian settlers, farming small plots, trading locally, and marrying within their community. But behind the mountains, the legal world was changing fast. In 1834, Tennessee rewrote its constitution. A single line sealed the fate of hundreds of Melungeon families. Only free white persons may vote. own land, or testify in court. With one stroke of the pen, landowners became free persons of color. Children were barred from public schools. Families lost the right to defend their property. A neighbor's accusation could cost someone everything. The most famous example was Vardy Collins, a respected Melungeon veteran of the War of 1812. A white neighbor claimed Collins's 300-acre farm. Collins appeared in court to defend his deed, only to be told he couldn't testify because his newly assigned racial status disqualified him. He lost the land instantly. His family was forced up onto poorer, rockier mountain slopes, places no one else wanted. This pattern spread across counties in Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. Each time racial laws tightened, Melungeon families were pushed into terrain where the soil was thin. Farming was difficult, and communities had to rely heavily on one another. The isolation that followed was painful. Yet ironically, it became the very thing that preserved their unique ancestry. Cut off from towns and courts, they built their own insular world. A world where a few families intermarried for generations because marrying outside the community often meant hostility, violence, or legal risk. This isolation didn't just shape their daily lives, it shaped their DNA itself. When Melungeon families were pushed up onto the ridges of Newman's Ridge, Stony Creek, and Blackwater in the 1800s, they did not simply form isolated towns. They created a closed genetic loop. Only a small set of core surnames dominated these mountaintop communities: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bowling, Minor, and Mullins. For generations, these families married within the community because marrying outside could bring legal danger or intense social hostility. This produced what geneticists call the founder effect, where a small population preserves rare genetic lineages that would normally disappear in larger groups. In the Melungeons, this founder effect became unusually strong. Church records show the pattern clearly. A Collins son marries a Gibson daughter. Their children marry Mullins cousins. A Goins nephew marries into the Collins line again. These marriages were not about tradition. They were about survival and necessity. Isolation also preserved rare medical patterns. Doctors in the 20th century observed conditions usually found in Mediterranean populations. One example is familial Mediterranean fever, a hereditary inflammatory disorder. Another is Behçet's disease, an autoimmune condition more common in Turkey, the Middle East, and North Africa. These conditions were not present in surrounding Appalachian communities, suggesting that some Melungeon ancestors carried deep Mediterranean or Middle Eastern roots long before they reached the mountains. A genetic paradox emerges. Most isolated groups become genetically uniform. The Melungeons became a mosaic. They preserved European, African, Native American, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern lineages inside a small, secluded community for more than a century. Researchers such as Dr. Kevin Jones, one of the earliest to map Melungeon Y-DNA and mtDNA lines, noted that the genetic diversity inside this geographically small population was, in his words, unlike any other group in the United States. This isolation did not hide their ancestry. It protected it, waiting for modern DNA science to reveal what history had concealed. When Melungeon descendants began taking part in DNA studies in the early 2000s, researchers expected a simple mixture typical of Appalachian communities. Instead, the results shocked them. Paternal haplogroups, also called Y-DNA, the Y chromosome lines, passed from father to son, traced back to multiple continents: R1b from Western Europe, E1b1a from West and Central Africa, J2 and J1 from the Middle East and the Mediterranean region, QM3 from Native American ancestors, I2 and G2a from Southeast Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. These were not rare outliers. They appeared again and again across Melungeon surnames. Maternal haplogroups, also called mtDNA maternal lines, revealed an equally complex picture: European H and U lineages, African L1 and L2 lineages, Native American A, B, C, and D lineages, and astonishingly rare M and N lineages, which are usually found in South Asia and the Middle East. These last two lineages are extremely rare in the United States, yet they survived in Melungeon families because of the founder effect, the 0.01% mutation. One study identified a mitochondrial mutation found in only 0.01% of the global population. This mutation appears in only 3 places on Earth: northern Portugal, the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and Melungeon-derived communities in Appalachia. The implication was unmistakable. Some Melungeon ancestors came from very specific populations in Iberia and North Africa. Genetic age aligns with colonial records. Autosomal DNA studies, including work by researchers such as Roberta Estes, showed that this mixture did not come from recent events. It dates back 300 to 400 years, aligning perfectly with the earliest settlement periods in colonial Virginia and North Carolina. The DNA does not point to one shipwreck, one lost colony, or any single dramatic event. Instead, it reveals something far more complex and far more historically grounded. To find the beginning of their story, we must return to the colonial frontier, long before America built its strict racial boundaries.
Then everything changed. America began, mixed. But one orphan shouldn't exist here.
To understand Melungeon origins, we need to step back into the 1600s, a time period that is almost never taught accurately. Before America created rigid racial boundaries, the colonies functioned as a human crossroads. Iberian influence. Portuguese and Spanish sailors often jumped ship in Virginia and Carolina ports. Some joined native communities, others lived as free men, married locally, and left Iberian genetic signatures that would later appear in Melungeon DNA. Free Africans in the early colonies. Many Africans in early Virginia were not enslaved. They worked as indentured laborers, just like their English or Irish counterparts. Some earned freedom, land, and legal status before racial laws hardened later in the century. They lived, worked, and intermarried with Europeans, native tribes, and other free mixed families. Turkish, Moorish, and North African captives. Spanish and Portuguese ships often carried enslaved or captured men from Ottoman regions, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Through shipwrecks, piracy, and coastal raids, some of these men were brought into the early Carolina settlements. There, they blended into local families and left lasting genetic traces. Native American alliances. The Saponi, the Catawba, the Occaneechi, and several smaller tribes absorbed outsiders, formed alliances, and intermarried freely during this unstable frontier era. European indentured communities. Poor English families, Scots-Irish settlers, Welsh laborers, and even some Sephardic Jewish migrants lived alongside these groups. Together, they created a blended frontier culture with shared work, shared hardship, and shared ancestry. Documented families prove the pattern. Historian Tim Hashal identified several early free-mixed families who later connect to Melungeon lines. One example is John Collins, recorded as a Turk in Virginia in the 1640s, who married a native woman. Another is the Ishmael family, Portuguese-identified settlers in 1690s North Carolina, who blended African, native, and European ancestry. By the early 1700s, dozens of similar families lived across the Virginia and Carolina frontier. But as racial laws grew stricter, these free mixed families faced increasing restrictions. Many moved westward into the mountains, seeking a place where the law could not define them, confine them, or erase their identity. Generations later, these mountain communities would be known collectively as the Melungeons. Because their origins were mysterious, many theories emerged to explain the Melungeons. Some contained pieces of truth, others were never meant to illuminate. It was outsiders projecting myths onto a people they didn't understand. Here's what the evidence really supports. The Portuguese shipwreck theory. Partially true. There's no evidence of a single defining shipwreck, but there is proof of multiple Iberian individuals, sailors, traders, indentured servants, entering Virginia and Carolina communities. Iberian DNA segments in Melungeon descendants support scattered but real influence. The Turkish, Ottoman slave theory, historically plausible. Mediterranean and North African haplogroups appear in the DNA. Records mention Turks and Moors living freely in early Virginia. It wasn't a mass migration, but several documented individuals fit the profile. Lost colony of Roanoke theory, almost certainly false. A romantic idea, but autosomal DNA does not support a direct link between Melungeons and the Roanoke settlers. Any English influence came through intermarriage with later colonial families, not a vanished colony. Triracial isolate theory, too simplistic. The idea that Melungeons were just a mix of European, African, and native peoples is incomplete. It ignores the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and North African lineages clearly shown in DNA and early records. The real story. The Melungeons weren't descendants of a single event. They were formed by free Africans, Iberian sailors, European indentured laborers, Native American groups, Mediterranean and North African individuals, all mixing before racial borders hardened, then moving into the mountains as America became obsessed with categories. A story far more complex and far more revealing than any single myth could capture.
Then everything changed. America began, mixed. But one orphan shouldn't exist here.
By the late 1800s, Melungeon families had learned a difficult reality. Their safety depended entirely on how others classified them. Laws didn't just restrict rights, they punished ambiguity. So Melungeon families adapted in the only way they could. They were Portuguese on marriage records, Indian when avoiding unfair taxation, white when voting in counties where no one recognized them, and free people of color when census clerks insisted on reassigning them. This wasn't deception, it was survival in a system where a single word could determine land, freedom, or the fate of children. Census clerks controlled everything. Clerks frequently changed a family's racial category without explanation. 1830. Free-colored, 1840. Mulatto, 1850. Indian, 1860. White. The same person, the same family, different labels, assigned like administrative guesses. Mahala Mullins, the woman they couldn't arrest. Mahala Mullins became a quiet legend. Nearly 500 pounds, immovable, she lived high on Newman's Ridge selling moonshine. Sheriffs came repeatedly with warrants, but none could physically remove her from her porch. She became a symbol of a people who refused to be erased, even when the law tried to crush them. But for most Melungeon families, this era wasn't defiant. It was fragile. Parents avoided discussing ancestry. Old photographs were hidden. Family stories ended with, "Don't ask about that." And still, the pressure intensified. In the early 1900s, the rise of American eugenics brought one of the darkest moments in Melungeon history. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 declared anyone with even a hint of non-white ancestry legally colored. This law wasn't abstract. It specifically targeted families like the Melungeons. State officials became obsessed with tracking them. Most infamous was Virginia Registrar Walter Plecker, who kept lists of suspicious surnames, rewrote birth certificates, reclassified families without consent, and sent inspectors into mountain schools to examine children's hair, skin tone, and features. A rumor, an anonymous letter, or a surname could destroy an entire family's legal standing. The Ramsey family tragedy. One Melungeon heritage family, long integrated into white society, saw everything collapse in 1943 when they were reclassified. Children expelled from college, business contracts canceled, a daughter's engagement broken, the family forced to flee the state and change their name. This was not rare. Dozens of families disappeared from Appalachian records during this period, becoming white, black, native, or simply leaving the region entirely. By mid-century, the Melungeons as a visible community seemed to vanish. But then came a tool no bureaucrat could control: genetic testing. By the late 1990s, the Melungeons existed mostly as a whisper, an old family rumor, a story older relatives refused to explain, or a surname that didn't quite match the ancestry people believed they had. Then home DNA testing arrived. A woman in Ohio discovered Iberian and North African ancestry she couldn't trace. A man in Indiana, told all his life he was pure Scotch-Irish, found Native American and African DNA clusters he never expected. In Tennessee, people with familiar Appalachian surnames suddenly matched dozens of strangers across the country: Collins, Goins, Gibson, Mullins, with no idea how those names connected. One by one, scattered families began noticing the same pattern. Online communities put the puzzle together. As genealogy forums, early roots web groups, and later social media pages appeared. Descendants compared. Shared surnames, ridge-top family origins, old photos with strikingly similar features, unexplained Iberian, African, or Mediterranean DNA segments. The more researchers compared the results, the clearer the connection became. These were descendants of the same mountain families that history had almost erased. Autosomal DNA completed what Y-DNA and mtDNA began. Earlier genetic tests could trace only one direct line of ancestry. Y-DNA followed the father's line. mtDNA followed the mother's line. Autosomal DNA changed everything because it reveals ancestry across all branches of the family tree. This method allowed researchers such as Roberta Estes to identify distinctive segment patterns in families with Melungeon ancestry. For example, Iberian clusters appearing on multiple chromosomes, North African and Moorish segments, Middle Eastern haplotypes persistent across cousin groups. African lineages matching early free communities of Virginia Native American segments, consistent with Saponi, Catawba, and other Piedmont tribes. These weren't random traces from modern mixing. They were shared segments, meaning they came from the same small founding population in the 1600s and 1700s. Autosomal DNA confirmed what documents and oral stories hinted for 2 centuries. The Melungeons were not formed in the mountains. They came from free mixed colonial families long before the United States created its racial boundaries. A revelation for thousands. For many descendants, discovering a Melungeon connection didn't just rewrite their family tree. It explained generations of secrecy, why an ancestor changed counties to be recorded as white, why a family Bible had missing pages, why elders insisted they were Portuguese, even when that didn't match appearances. DNA didn't just reconnect families, it gave them back a story they were never allowed to keep. And for a people pushed into silence for over a century, this rediscovery became something powerful, the return of an identity once forced underground. Today, the Melungeon story is re-emerging, not as a mystery, but as a rediscovered identity. Linguistic clues. Resurface words like seguglin, crooked, jasper, stranger, and cousin Branchin. Reflect influences from Elizabethan English, Iberian phrasing, indigenous syntax. These fragments are linguistic fossils, survivors of a time when cultures blended before anyone thought to record them. Food, music, and family traditions find new life. Old dishes show surprising Mediterranean or North African parallels. Ballads carry rhythms found in both Appalachian folk and Iberian seafarer traditions. Even herbal medicine blends indigenous and European techniques, reclaiming an identity. Once forbidden, younger generations now join Melungeon heritage groups, trace genealogy, compare DNA matches, and uncover documents their grandparents hid out of fear. For them, this identity is no longer something dangerous. It's a missing piece of who they are. And for many, it has created a new question. When a family carries Europe, Africa, Asia, and Native America, what box should they check? The Melungeons show that ancestry cannot always fit labels, and identity is larger than any category a census once forced upon them. The Melungeon origin story is not a myth or a mystery. It is a reminder. A reminder that America was far more diverse in its beginnings than most histories will admit. That before race became law, it was simply life, and that entire communities can be pushed into silence, yet carry the truth inside their bodies for centuries. Their ancestors were European sailors, African freedmen, Native American matriarchs, Mediterranean captives, frontier settlers, mixed families fleeing a rigid society, all converging in a handful of Appalachian ridges. History tried to erase them, politics tried to classify them, but DNA remembered, and today, as descendants reconnect online and uncover lost fragments of culture, the Melungeon story finally returns to the world, not as rumor, but as truth. If your family has whispered origins, unexpected DNA results, or stories that never quite fit the official version, share them in the comments. You never know whose roots might intertwine with yours. Thank you for watching Where Forgotten Histories Find Their Way Home.